Thank you for that generous introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming for a little deep dive this afternoon. I cannot tell you how honored I am, I'll try to tell you, to be the recipient of the Mendel Medal this year. Haven't received it yet, but it's coming, I understand. It's especially a privilege to be here in my home turf. I consider this part of Pennsylvania and my point of origin right across the river as sort of one part of geography. I used to come to Philadelphia on a big expedition to the city every once in a while when I was a kid. And actually, although I did begin serious love affair with the ocean once my parents moved to Florida when I was 12, I actually got knocked over by a wave on the Jersey shore when I was 3, and the ocean got my attention, and it has held my attention ever since. But it's life in the ocean, life, that has really changed everything for me. So, I start this presentation with a fine old tree that I met earlier this year. It's an olive tree in Turkey. I was told that this tree was planted 500 years ago. Imagine the world as it was 500 years ago. That's when Magellan set out for the first circumnavigation of the world. At the time, the common way of thinking about the world is that Earth is the center of the universe, that the sun, the moon, stars, everything revolves around our home. But in the time since that first circumnavigation of the planet, a lot was learned, including the fact that Galileo staunchly maintained in face of great criticism that, no, we're just one of many. And we in the solar system, the heart of it is the sun, but the sun is just one of gazillions of other, I don't think he used that word gazillion, but we're just tiny in a universe. And our view of ourselves has expanded and continues to expand as we have learned more and more over the past 500 years. Well, in 2022, it's right around the corner, it'll be 200 years since Gregor Mendel arrived on Earth. Imagine what he would think if he could come today and see what little kids grow up today taking for granted, a view of Earth from space. It was a young man just 50 years ago, William Anders, astronaut, who with 2 others were circumnavigating the moon the first time. It was actually in December of 1968, on Christmas Eve, when this photograph was taken, that has literally changed everything. We can see ourselves with new eyes, and among other things, we can see that the world is blue. Appreciation for the magnitude of the ocean. Well, you could see it on a classroom globe even before we had this verification of the world as it truly is. But there's something about the reality of having a human being up there in the sky looking back, and now it's happened time and time again that humans have been lofted up into the sky and look back and see what no one in all of previous human history until the middle of the 20th century could see. and what we've learned since then. The kids of today, growing up with knowledge that could not exist when I was a child. We did not have the technology. We did not have the basis of information. A little bit of information here, a little bit there, and together, finally, you get concepts, you get an understanding that you could not see before right about now. When I was an aspiring young scientist, my first class in genetics was in 1955. This was pre-DNA, RNA, and all the rest that has followed. But the understanding that when Gregor Mendel actually made the discoveries that have transformed the way we think about, well, biology, about ourselves, about the way the world works. It, I was told, took 35 years before people began to accept and understand and appreciate the magnitude of what he had discovered with his painstaking work with pea plants, crossing them and coming up with insights that had escaped even the smartest minds that had been around up until that time. And even those who heard him talk about his discoveries didn't quite get it for quite a while. But somehow it finally came to the surface. But it took a while. Today, a new discovery happens on one part of the planet, boom, through the internet, somebody over here hears about it over there. You don't even have to wait for a publication anymore to get fresh news about new insights, new discoveries. And it's a mixed blessing, I suppose, to have such instant information, especially when it turns out to be disinformation. But we do have an edge now, early in the 20th century, that our long ago predecessors could not imagine. The ability to go high in the sky, to go deep in the ocean, to have the ability to peer into cells right down to the molecular level, and to see more than ever before the answers to those big questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And maybe most importantly, armed with all this new insight, how are we going to get to a place in the future that is an enduring place? Lots of concerns now that we can see ourselves in the context with new eyes. When I began to explore the ocean as a would-be scientist back in the 1960s, my first expedition, real expedition, aside from my roamings around on my own, real expedition aboard a National Science Foundation supported vessel in the Indian Ocean. There we were, I and my fellow scientists, trying to discover what was under the ocean, and here we were on the top of the ocean. How do you figure it out? Well, we had scuba, some of the first scuba systems that were available for scientists to use. And we explored reefs and only down to, about 100 feet. You can go a little deeper, but effectively that's about as deep as we could go. The average depth of the ocean is 4,000 kilometers. It's 2.5 miles, 11 kilometers to the deepest part of the ocean. We're still up here, nibbling around the surface. So we lowered nets, hooks, the things that scientists years ago during the Challenger expedition in the late 1800s used when they began to explore the ocean globally for the first time. Just as a footnote, 1964, I was one of 70 people, the only one who was a girl. So when we got to Mombasa, the headlines in the Mombasa Daily Times said, "Sylvia sails away with 70 men." Huh? But she expects no problems. Of course we had problems. We had to figure out how to figure out what was in the ocean, and here we were up on the surface of the ocean, and we still have that problem. But we're getting better at solving that big issue of how we terrestrially equipped humans can actually dive in and get to know the ocean the way we take for granted we can visit a forest or a desert or a mountain on the land, and to get to know the creatures who live there. I'm mindful that Jane Goodall spent 15 years, day and night, in Gombe, getting to know one species, our fellow primate, the chimpanzees, very well. She had the audacity to recognize individuals, give them names. Her fellow scientists said that was terribly unscientific to give these creatures names. But she said it's ridiculous. Of course, they're individuals. Anyone who really looks can see that. Anyone who's had a cat or a dog or a horse or a canary or you name it. Or look at all of us. I guess to a fish swimming by, we might look all the same, but we know every one of us has a different face, a different personality, different DNA, we now know. But it's taken quite a lot of time for humans to figure that out. So I began splashing around using scuba in the mid-50s, and that led to living underwater. I've done it now 10 times, the first time in 1970. It is so cool. It's a little bit on a small scale, like Jane Goodall or George Schaller or others who have an opportunity to be with the animals of their choice for the long pull, day and night, just looking, watching, and learning from them. To stay underwater, to go visit with the creatures who live there, including your fellow aquanauts. It's necessary if we're really to understand what's going on under the surface of the ocean. Because if you stay on the surface, or if you just lower cameras, or drag nets or hooks, you don't have that, pardon the expression, depth of getting intimacy, of getting acquainted with who lives there and what they do. It's technology that has gotten us to the place where such things are possible, and literally we're just beginning to explore the ocean. We've only mapped the ocean floor with the same degree of accuracy that we have for the moon and Mars and Jupiter and the terrestrial part of this planet, only about 10%. And most of the real ocean, that is the surface to the bottom, the wet part of the ocean, the ocean, just a fraction of that has been seen and really documented with any kind of comparable accuracy to what we have for what we know about on the land. That includes the creatures who live there. We don't know how many there are, but far more than so far have been recorded. So getting out there, getting down there, walking around in the midst of all that wonderful explosion of life, the history of life on Earth, it's there. On the land, about 14, 15 major phyla of animals occur. In the ocean, they're there too. But in addition, there are another 14 or 15 of these major divisions of animals that are also there. In an area you can embrace with your arms. You can find in the ocean, like in a coral reef or in muddy sand out in the deep sea, or in the open ocean, in plankton, you can find 14 or 15 phyla of animals, major divisions of life. On the land, we've learned about species divisions, speciation, and on the order of, depends on how you count, on the order of 1.5 million individual species, a lot of beetles, a lot of insects generally, about 9,000 kinds of birds. But in the ocean, 33,000, well, freshwater and saltwater combined, about 33,000 kinds of fish, preceded birds in the long development of life on Earth by quite a lot. So getting out there and walking around as if you're in a forest and looking, getting to know the nature of who lives there. For me, it started in Dunedin, Florida. I don't know whether we can bump up the sound or whether I can be the sound, but it was William Beebe, a book that I read when I was about 13 years old, soon after my family moved to Florida. These two explorers, the New York Zoological Society, William Beebe, zoologist, Otis Barton, his partner engineer, came up with this little bathysphere, crawled inside and went down for the first time to see what life was like a half a mile beneath the surface. So fast forward to 1986, when I had a chance for the first time to go half a mile beneath the surface, and like Beebe and Barton, had to build my own submarine. It actually wasn't my submarine, but it was a vision that I had with fellow engineers to come up with a design, but you'll see there's only room for one person. It's a bit like putting on a diving suit. So if you are to use this system, you have to be the pilot and the observer. But the key is to come up with a system that is so easy to drive that even a scientist can do it. And it was during the 80s and 90s, and even today, the BBC is still using a two-person version of the Deep Rover sub that I had the pleasure of having my fingerprints all over the development of those systems, and using it, as I did just 2 years ago out in the Gulf of Mexico with the BBC. If you've seen Blue Planet 2, you might catch a glimpse of this little submarine, not this one, yeah, this one, the two-person one, in Antarctica, or in the Gulf of Mexico, and elsewhere, where they used it to film some of the amazing images of life under the sea. And for 5 years, with the National Geographic, the Sustainable Seas expeditions, we used a variety of little submersibles to be able to invite students and teachers and fellow scientists and others to climb in, take the controls, like learning how to drive a car, only a lot safer than driving a car. There's not much traffic down there. A lot of fish, but they tend to get out of the way. And to have students at each place that we visited around the coastline of this country, mostly places that had been designated or were in the works for future designation as parks, protected areas, sanctuaries. So it was pretty exciting to not only go and see for myself, but to watch the reaction of those who had not been deeper than you can go holding your breath or using scuba, down to as much as 1,000 meters beneath the surface, back to half mile down. And just last week, I was in the Galapagos Islands, a place that Gregor Mendel never got to go to see, but was a place that Charles Darwin did go to and was inspired with new levels of insight and understanding about who we are, where we've come from, and maybe where we might be going. We had another little submarine called the Deep Sea. It goes to 500 meters, takes 3 people, a pilot and 2 observers, and it is another tool. It's like spacecraft. We have airplanes and spacecraft of various sorts to take either ourselves or our avatar, if you will, with the satellites. We have robots going under the sea as well to bring back information, but there's nothing quite like actually going yourself and being a witness to what is there. So, the Galapagos Islands. This is the Darwin Arch in the northern Galapagos Islands. I first had an opportunity to go there in 1966. was the sharkiest place I think I'd ever seen. And it's still pretty sharky. This picture was taken just last week. But there's so much life there, underwater as well as above. People tend to think about the giant tortoises and the iguanas and the flightless cormorants and the sea lions and the penguins right there on the equator where currents converge, cold water coming up along the coast of South America, cold water coming from the west, cold water coming from the north, all swishing around the Galapagos Islands right on the equator. So you can be diving in nice tropical warm water and your toes can be in Antarctica, which explains the combination of penguins and cactuses and fur seals and sea lions in the presence of parrotfish and corals. So my objective on this occasion was to celebrate this as one of the first hope spots designated. First, soon after the beginning of Mission Blue in 2010, just 10 years ago, 2009 actually, and to add weight to the basis for why the ocean around the Galapagos should be at least as well protected as the land. Why? Because if you don't protect the waters around the Galapagos, the creatures on the land aren't going to survive in the long pool either. Seals, all of the birds, the boobies, the frigate birds, the penguins, the cormorants, all dive in to get their lunch and breakfast and dinner. And when humans come along, as we have in the last 30 years or so, and compete with them for groceries, take the fish of all sizes, it means that they are having a harder and harder time to exist. It's not just true in the Galapagos Islands, but this is a place that so many people have come to treasure as a scientific, again, treasure trove, if you will, of past insights and new insights increasingly. Oh, by the way, that's an octopus, not a rock, right in the front that I'm staring at, or I'm being stared at by the octopus. It's amazing. 97% of the land in the Galapagos has been protected now for some years, 3% dedicated for houses and buildings and gardens and places where people occupy, but the Darwin Station and the Galapagos government, the park authorities, do a pretty good job of enforcing protection for the creatures who dwell on the land, and that includes the humans. Now, more than 30,000 people living permanently and more than 200,000 visiting every year. But there has been an increase since I first visited, a 100-fold increase in the number of people who are coming or live at least part-time in the Galapagos. It was pretty much a place where the animals that Darwin got to see years ago were still very much intact. But the ocean has been opened to the extraction of wildlife. We call that fishing. And if you're feeding your families and communities, that has been possible to demonstrate can be done in the long pool, but bringing in large-scale nets, long lines, and other equipment, and using the international marketplace for what is taken locally has really taken a toll on the creatures of the Galapagos, the groupers, the snappers, and certainly the sharks. So part of the reason for our expedition was to meet with the local community. I've been doing this now over several decades, and trying to encourage enhanced support for the ocean, in part because of the ocean, but also if you care about what is on the land, it all ties together. And of course, I was interested in the seaweeds. Woo-ha! the kelps, we had special permission to take 2 samples for a young scientist, the woman that you see on the left side of the screen, who's working on her PhD based on a newly discovered deep water kelp forest in the Galapagos Islands. So we had a chance to go explore together in the little submarine, and deeper than you can go as a diver. We're talking a depth of, that's not a fish, that's the pilot adjusting the camera. This is where there's enough light for the kelps to flourish, and it's cold enough below the thermocline for the kelps to flourish, but it's too deep to go as a standard scuba diver, which is maybe 50 meters at the most, and this was just beyond that, 60 to 100 meters. The kelp forest was prospering. And even more exciting in some ways was going down to 1,000 feet, 300 meters or so, to see, again, what you can see in the deep sea almost everywhere, a cross-section of life on Earth. Again, on the land, you don't find sponges, you don't find bryozoans, you don't see starfish, you don't see brittle stars, or many of the variations on the theme of invertebrates that are universally present somewhere in some numbers, almost everywhere under the sea. Even in the muddy banks off of New Jersey, you can find a rich diversity of invertebrates that tell the story of life on Earth. And they're still there. That's the great thing, that armed with new technologies, and I can't resist, I'm still working with engineers to come up with new designs, because I would love to see every one of you hop into a submarine of your choice and take off on a Saturday afternoon, go to Hertz, rent a sub, or have one in your garage if you like. Some people own airplanes, why not have a little submarine to go with it? And just see what's out there to be seen. We have done a pretty good job of looking at much of the land, identifying creatures from tops of the trees to the depths of the soil below. We still have a lot to learn about what's there, but the ocean, we're just literally beginning to scratch the surface. The census of marine life that took place from 2000 to 2010, involving several thousand scientists globally, new expeditions, diving into old records, anticipating what might be there in the future, but really taking a hard look at what do we know about who lives there now. And they came up with an assessment of about 250,000 individual species that have been documented and verified. Well, when you consider that 97% of the biosphere, living space on the planet, is ocean, and about 3% is all the rest, it doesn't make sense that there should be fewer animals and plants and microbes, archaea, the whole range of life on Earth, in the ocean than there is on the land. And what it seems to illustrate is where we are. We are terrestrial. We have been looking at our neighbors on the land for a very long time. We're just beginning to lift the lid of the ocean and explore. So what are the real numbers? Well, the estimates for what actually lives in the ocean in terms of species, since that is a measure that has some validity to it in terms of the diversity of life, low figure, 1 million, high figure, 10, maybe even more, especially if you consider microbes, where we just lose all sense of knowing what is a species when you're talking about archaea and bacteria. We're just beginning to get our minds around the capacity that these small but amazing and durable creatures have. And It's our limitation, it's not theirs. We just have to figure out how to define numbers and characteristics. But one thing we have discovered, and most of this has happened since I began exploring the ocean, is how important the ocean is in terms of shaping planetary chemistry, shaping climate, shaping weather, shaping life on Earth. And it is life on Earth, life in the ocean, that sets this planet apart. It's not just the rocks and water. The water is critical. The rocks, of course, important. But it's the fact that there's life that governs the chemistry, life that generates most of the oxygen in the atmosphere, life in the ocean. Of course, we know trees generate oxygen and capture carbon, but the realization that the heavy lifting is actually out there underwater with these tiny little guys, diatoms, coccolithophorids, and Prochlorococcus, that Penny Chisholm, a scientist at MIT, and her colleagues did not discover until 1986, quite by chance, using a method that hadn't been employed before, to look at the ultra-small things that had been noticed before. It turns out that on the order of maybe 20% of the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from Prochlorococcus, a blue-green bacterium alone. Many variations on the theme, because again, what is a species in one of these little microbial guys? Mostly diatoms in this image, but they in turn give rise to zooplankton, little fish, little jellies, little starfish, little crabs, little this, little that, chaetognaths, you name it. There is the real zoo on Earth. They are so beautiful, and they're so abundant, and they're so important to everything else, including the chemistry of the ocean, because every time a little jelly gets nibbled on by a bigger thing, nutrients get passed through, carbon dioxide is given off, nutrients are poured back in, oxygen is consumed. It's a dynamic, living system. So many people think of the ocean as water, not living soup, but it is alive. And to be a witness to that really brings it home. And the point is to be a witness about food chains in action without becoming a part of the food chain in action. But clearly, in this case, the sharks are intent on the little fish, and so are the dolphins, and so are the little birds that dive in from the surface. You just don't want to be a little anchovy about this point in time. Everybody wants to eat you, but fortunately enough survive in a normal scenario back sort of pre-20th century. Now we have become competitors and outcompeting everybody else with our scale of extraction of wildlife, and at the same time putting things into the ocean that have never been in the ocean before. You know, the last half century has really been a time of unprecedented change in the ocean, of course on the land as well, but what happens in the ocean affects everything else. So it's what we've been taking out of the ocean, but also what we're putting into the ocean. Some call this the Plasticozoic era that we are sharing. And again, experiencing it as a fish might really brings home the magnitude of the problem that we have created, not realizing that plastics could be a problem. They're such a convenient thing, and I dare say every one of us, one way or the other, uses or is touched by plastic every day. It's not plastic that is the fault, the problem. It's not knowing what to do with it when we're through with it, or thinking through the issue, the life cycle of the plastic stuff, including fishing gear that is lightweight and readily disposable, but causing enormous toll in terms of the take, incidentally and unavoidably, of birds, of fish that were not targeted for taking, and more than 100,000 marine mammals every year killed by entanglement in lost or tossed fishing gear. The new issue on the horizon is, okay, so let's have some biodegradable, or degradable at least, plastics, so they just break up, and then they go away, except they don't. They don't go away. The great thing about plastic materials, these synthetic goods that have served us so well and continue to do so, is that they're durable right down to the molecular level. So a lot of excitement right now about microplastics getting into everything, even more nanoplastics that you can't really see without microscopic help or some way to detect their presence chemically in the water you drink, in the beer you drink, if you're into that, in the food that you eat, in the air you breathe. It's just like everywhere. And we've done it to ourselves with costs that we haven't yet begun to get our minds around. But knowing we've got a problem is the first giant step towards solving the problem. We're the only ones who can do it. Sharks can't. They are surrounded by this new element in their environment, and they didn't cause it, we did. And we have looked at these big predatory animals as a threat to us. Now we are a big threat to them, in part because of what we're putting into their environment, but also the numbers that we are extracting from the ocean. Best calculations are that 90% of the sharks, mostly the big ones, but some of the small ones too, have been extracted since the 1980s. They've been around for 300 million years. And in a few decades, we have taken these extraordinary and extraordinarily important part of the ecosystem out of the ocean, with consequences that we're just beginning to think about and measure in terms of the changing chemistry of the ocean, and therefore of the planet, and therefore our home, at risk because of taking so much wildlife out of the ocean. And it isn't just sharks taken for luxury food, for shark fin soup. Consider tuna. Their numbers too, down on the order of 90% or more for bluefin tuna, and the trend is the same for all tunas, skipjack, yellowfin, you name it. We've been marketed over the past few decades to gobble up tuna of all sorts. And we've done a pretty good job of gobbling them up, because they, along with swordfish, along with tons of other wild creatures from the sea, have been introduced into our diet. Now, along with what they have been consuming, we are consuming. Consider microplastics, nanoplastics, pesticides, herbicides, fire retardants, you name it. What we've been putting in the ocean comes back through the food chain right to us. But we have a choice. Creatures in the sea don't. Now, I've been around long enough to remember when whaling was still considered to be an honorable way to make a living. We celebrated whalers, and they just did not really know at the time what the consequences of taking whales were. We thought whales, as we think of fish today, they're products. And it didn't take that long, considering the long history of whales on Earth. For humans, it took a few centuries, but mostly in the 20th century, to take their numbers from where they were to down to a precariously low level. The good news is we figured it out. We could take them all, or we had a choice. We could not take them all. We could protect whales, and whether you like them alive or dead, if we didn't stop killing them globally, there wouldn't be whales. We would not have a choice. So I visited the last whaling station in Australia in 1978. These are the remains of 6 young sperm whales. Soon after that, Australia voted nationally to get out of whaling. Today, there are more sperm whales, more humpback whales, more whales generally, for a very simple reason. We stopped killing them. I mean, a few nations still do, but generally speaking, there's been a movement to look at other values, the worth of a whale, not just for the dollars and cents of whale watching. More people want to see a live whale than see a dead whale. They actually pay money to go see live whales. I've done it myself. But the value of a whale, the value of a tuna, the value of a shrimp, the value of a jelly, the value of any living thing in the ocean is part of the chemistry of the ocean. One thing that is coming into focus is a recognition that the most important thing that we extract from the ocean is our existence. The ocean shapes the chemistry of the planet. And here we are, the beneficiaries. Ocean holds the greatest diversity and abundance of life. But because of us, we're putting at risk not only knowing about who is there, because we're losing species, we're losing ecosystems, and in the process losing species that are home bodies that don't have a wide range. When a coral reef is blown up, we lose all the creatures who were there, including some that were only found in that small part of the planet. So headlines now. I think about the headlines in the late 1960s and the 1970s of looking at Earth from space for the first time and realizing this is our home, that there are things that we were already doing that we could see that were causing trouble. New laws came into place, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, you name it, a long series of things in this country and around the world. We began in this country and around the world to actually put parks in the ocean for the first time. Areas where even the fish, even the lobsters, even the shrimp had safe havens. Not a lot of area presently, even after a lot of thinking and action over the last 40 years or so. Only about 3% of the ocean actually is safe for wildlife in the sea by our proactive behavior. The rest of it is open for extraction, but it is shifting. Part of it is a recognition that life in the ocean affects this big issue, the new headline that is getting people energized about who we are and where we might be going. It's climate. Blue carbon, the ocean, as the place where much of the carbon is captured and held in the fish, in the shrimp, in the polar bears, if you will, knowing that the ocean is the driver of the carbon cycle, the oxygen cycle, the nitrogen cycle, you name it. It's the driver of the way the planet basically works. We have now new eyes focused on big issues. Looking at Earth from space, that was a big breakthrough. Going back to looking at how life behaves 200 years ago, with Gregor Mendel and his discoveries. Looking back even further, 500 years ago, with Galileo, with the explorations around the world that have brought us to where we now are, poised as never before, as we face the new crisis of climate change. And looking in the mirror, the polar bears are not causing this. The polar bears are innocent. Coral reefs are innocent. The bleaching of coral reefs, the destruction of them because of overfishing, taking too much, or pollution, it's not their fault. We are the problem, but we're also the solution. I just want everyone to go out and see creatures in the sea the way Jane Goodall has gotten to know chimpanzees. Oh, of course you can look at them on your plate. Any seafood restaurant will allow you to do that and encourage you to do that. I encourage you to go see sea life, seafood, if you will. I prefer sea life with a different attitude. They're individuals. Individuals. Now we know what our predecessors could not imagine. Imagine if if we could take Gregor Mendel in a submarine down into the ocean and take him out to see the biggest fish in the sea. I'd love to have all of you do that too. Some of you probably have. The whale sharks, and to realize no two whale sharks are exactly alike. No, I mean, it's a miracle. Two big miracles of life. The great diversity, no two individual anything exactly alike. Whether we're talking cats or dogs or horses or chimpanzees or whale sharks, no two pattern of spots on whale sharks are identical. People were taking photographs and using a new modeling technique to be able to determine by looking at the pattern of spots who that whale is. In a big database, you can track whales by their spots, whale sharks. You can track whales, too, by their tails. We're just beginning to realize we have some really interesting neighbors on the planet, and that they are worthy of our attention. If we could just listen to them, if they could speak. And, you know, some people are listening. This is, of course, President George W. Bush, who's an avid fisherman, but it sort of got to him when some of us were having dinner, a remarkable occasion that was engineered by Laura Bush, that, you know, if there are to be fishermen, Mr. President, there have to be fish. And if there are to be fish, you've got to protect breeding areas and feeding areas. You can't take them everywhere all the time in any numbers, just as with birds or with anything else. Safe havens, protecting them, understanding the value beyond just something that is delicious. So it was George W. Bush in the latter part of his administration that he established the largest marine protected area on the planet at the time, the Papahanaumokuakea Marine Reserve in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And then, boom, along comes Obama, President Obama, and quadrupled the size of that little patch of blue in the big blue earth that we call home. Still a tiny patch, even though it was 4 times larger than what had been the biggest marine protected area on the planet. It's a trend, though. The goal for the United Nations is 10% by next year, 2020. The Sustainable Development Goals that were set some time ago, that by 2020 we'll have 10% of the ocean protected. We only have 3% that's really protected, maybe a little more than 7% that has quasi-protection. And some are saying, and a lot of people are getting on board, for 30% by 2030. Is that enough? Shouldn't we respect all of the ocean in every way? Of course, use the ocean. Of course, take some wildlife as a source of food. But we cannot continue taking at the level we currently are and still have a planet that works, the chemistry of the planet, the climate of the planet, the diversity of life that is so important in maintaining the integrity, the stability of this miraculous little speck in space. So, there's some leaders, like President Tommy Ramingasau of Palau, little island in Micronesia, who has boldly led his people to protect 80% of their entire exclusive economic zone, leaving 20% for multiple use. And the president of Chile is hosting the next climate conference in December. He's calling it the Blue COP, where for the first time, the ocean will be the headline at a climate conference. Because, I mean, after all, the ocean governs climate, shapes planetary temperature and chemistry and all the rest. So this particular president, President Piñera, is a diver. Oh my goodness, he gets it. He dives into the ocean. He looks at the creatures there. Yes, I think he sometimes looks at them on his plate. But he has a sympathy based on experience, firsthand experience of exploring the ocean. We need more individuals of all sizes, ages, shapes, levels of whatever to go out there, dive in, and get acquainted with life on Earth. So by establishing this network of communities around the world, now 133 at most recent count, including the Galapagos Islands, including a place in Chile that will be visited, the fjords of Chile, coming up in November of this year. Palau is certainly a glowing hope spot, as well as the Papanamukua Kea Marine Reserve, where communities of people are nominating and pledging, committing to do what they can to turn the view of the ocean from just a place where we take, supporting increasingly what's being known as the blue economy. Let's go dive in the ocean and take more. Well, maybe we should just hesitate and think about what we're already taking. Take a breath. Thank you, ocean. Take a drink of water. Oh, thank you, ocean. Look in the mirror. You're alive. Thank you, ocean. I met this bird not so long ago, halfway across the Pacific Ocean. She's been given a name by the people who know her on Midway Island. She's known as Wisdom. She's an albatross. She began flying about the same time that I began learning how to dive in the 1950s. And then sitting there, just looking at her, wondering what she has witnessed in her lifetime, flying over thousands of miles of open ocean, bringing back food for her single chick. She and her lifetime mate share the responsibility. One egg, if they're lucky, every year. One mature chick every once in a while over the years. I'm confident that she, with her bird brain, which is a compliment, not derogatory, has recognized that food is harder to find, that there's a lot more stuff out there, all that plastic debris, more noise in the ocean, more action overhead, whatever. She's witnessed the changes that all of us have witnessed in the last few decades. But she doesn't know why the changes are happening, and she doesn't, even if she did know, would not know what to do about it. We know. We are witnesses. I have been a witness to much of the same kinds of change. Fewer fish, more plastic. Fewer birds, more plastic. But what I know that she cannot know is that there are reasons for hope. This is a moment in time, as never before, when we have not just the power of knowledge, and I'm looking at it right now, what all of you know that was unknowable when you were kids. And certainly I've experienced that. I've been around longer than most of you. We have superpowers. And it starts with understanding that we've got problems and that we do have power to do something about it. We don't have to wait for leaders to act, or heads of corporations or whatever, although we should do what we can to encourage them to do the right thing, but we can start with us. Every one of us has power. And I look at those individuals, not just on the earth today, but during times in past. Who are those individuals who stand out and who have won our respect because they took action, or they discovered something, or they just wouldn't let an idea sit still. They just had to pursue it, and made all the difference. None of those who existed before the present time could know what is now knowable. I personally am deeply honored to be accorded the Mendel Medal with a special feeling of respect for a man who had a vision, had an idea, and wouldn't let it go, and just kept at it over the years. And despite the fact that people around him were skeptics and didn't really understand the magnitude of his discovery, he knew he had done something special. it's there for others to do as well. Something that you care about, that you will just dive into and not let go. It's how the world changes, because individuals make it so. I really thank you for being here and sharing a little dive into the ocean with me, and look forward to what follows. Thank you.
Questions for the speaker?
Brave woman.
Does this work? Okay. I'm a huge fan, by the way. My question, you talked a lot about overfishing, and I was wondering if you thought like aquaculture was like a good alternative, or, you know, if that's like not really something we should be pursuing while people still want to eat fish.
What do you mean by define the term?
Oh, like, you know, making like fish farms where you could like grow salmon instead of like fishing it from, well, salmon isn't in the ocean really, like growing tuna somewhere rather than fishing it from the ocean. Do you think that's something?
Could you repeat it for me?
So doing fish farming, raising fish
Oh.
kind of outside of the ocean, is that a good alternative?
Okay, is fish farming a good alternative? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
It's smart aquaculture has a place in our future, I suppose, but I think there is also stupid aquaculture. We're growing carnivorous creatures as a source of food. Doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it. Took 10,000 years to grow animals as a source of food, and we chosen plant-eating animals, cows, chickens, pigs, turkeys, ducks. They grow fast, don't mind crowding, and you know, within a year or sometimes two, you can get an animal that we consume. But in the ocean, it takes at least 10 years for a bluefin tuna to mature, and it's had a lot of groceries along the way, all animal, until you get down to Prochlorococcus, diatoms, and all the rest. And when you add those up, it's like tens of thousands of pounds of plants to make a single pound of tuna. And the same recipe for most big carnivores. Sharks take like maybe 15, sometimes 20 years to mature. And they too are not plant eaters. They eat animals, but finally you get down to the start of it all, sunlight, photosynthesis, and small things are eaten by bigger things. But to make a pound of shark, it takes this much phytoplankton and this many years, and it's not a very efficient way, not a reasonable way to feed 8 billion people. So you have to make a choice. Is your goal in aquaculture to have money? You want to serve a luxury market? Okay, go for salmon. Go for sturgeon, caviar. Grow whatever it is that people have a taste for and will pay for. If you want to feed people, if it's food security, for heaven's sakes, don't take wildlife. They're more important alive than on your plate. And if you, I mean, you don't, how many, we used to take wild birds. We took all of the passenger pigeons. We almost took all of the buffalo, but we almost killed all the whales, but we stopped. Maybe we'll learn how to respect tuna for something other than casserole and sushi and sashimi and all that. But, you know, it's not feeding people in need, it's feeding a luxury taste. If you're feeding people and feeding them well, you'll eat plants a lot more, lower in the food chain. If you want to eat animals or choose to eat animals, because it is a choice, not a need, then go for things that have a lighter touch. Chicken takes 2 pounds of plants for 1 pound of chicken. Pigs and cows and lamb, all that, on the order of 20 pounds of plants to make 1 pound of a cultivated herbivore. And try to be careful, because we're now taking a lot of wild fish and grinding it up to feed to chickens. So if your chicken tastes a little fishy, it's probably a little fishy. So aquaculture, growing plants, there are some that look very promising and interesting for various reasons, including sources of pharmaceuticals as well as food, especially on the low end of the bacteria, the microbes. They grow fast. They have so many different variations that we might be able to bend to our interest, fungi as well. And if you, again, more familiar things, tilapia is more like chicken, about 2 pounds of plants to make 1 pound of tilapia in a year, and catfish. So just do your homework. But open ocean aquaculture, I think, is very risky. You're displacing some things and polluting things or adding chemicals to the ocean where they really should not be. I'm not saying rule it out entirely, but there are other things that we can do if we want to feed people. If you're looking for luxury choices, you need to think about the real cost. Fish in the ocean are regarded as free goods. Let's just go get them, right? Which is why we've reached that point that we currently are. We don't value them for their real value.
Thank you.
Okay.
Time for one more question.
I'll try to be shorter so I can get 2 more questions.
I'm an avid scuba diver, and I wanted to know what your opinion on this kind of push, like the bleaching of the barrier reef. And they say, come see it before it's gone. And it takes all the hope out of the conservation efforts and treats it just as one big temporary tourist attraction. How do you re-inject hope into the bleaching coral conservation?
Could you repeat it? Just so.
You're saying that there's lots of tourism around scuba diving with the catchphrase that the coral is being bleached, so you got to come see it now before it's gone. There's no hope. How do you re-inject?
How do you keep hope with the disasters that are all about, like the Great Barrier Reef with 90% decline? Well, 10% is still there in pretty good shape. Around the world, half the coral reefs are either gone or in terrible shape. But if we did not know that, if we were, just looking here instead of with a global view of what's causing these problems, we have solutions. And by acting on what we know can be done, one of the things is about the taking of wildlife. Coral reefs are not just suffering because of warming, although that's a major factor, or chemical or plastic pollution. Those are other factors. It's the stripping those reefs of wildlife, the groupers, the snappers, the sea cucumbers, the lobsters. They're all part of what makes those systems function. It's like New York City is not just about the buildings. It's the taxi drivers, it's the doctors, it's the maybe lawyers, I don't know. Anyway, I think the awareness is growing that we've got a problem, and the awareness is also growing about we can do something about it. And where places are protected, cause for hope is you see recovery. You can't go back to what was, but you surely can improve on what is by conscious actions. If you look in the mirror and say, oh, we're the problem, we're the ones who have to fix it.
Thank you.
All right, let's take our speaker away.